Let's talk about the Bible. Just to remind you that this is a class on how we got the Bible, and just so that you will track with me and I will track with you, the timeline review that we're going to go on is last week we went through the message from God, talking about how we received God's word through the manuscript and how He's given us commandments to do that, share it, pass it on, write it down, and make sure people know it. And then we talked about the different versions of writings in the ancient world and how it got passed. Information finally, instead of just by word, started to be passed down to future generations through etchings and writings on stone, clay. Ostraca, papyrus, wood and wax, and then in parchment. So that just gave us an overview of how the word was transmitted to us. So today what we're going to talk about is maybe I didn't turn it on. No luck. Yeah, it's on. I saw one go up there, and then it went away. Oh, okay. Is there a different one to use?
There'll be one.
Thank you, sir. All right, so the whole course is on the origin, preservations, and impact. And this is lesson 3, so we combined lesson 1 and 2 last week, and this week we're going to combine lesson 3, and we're going to try to get through lesson 4 also. So what we're looking at is how we got the books from the Bible and how they're transmitted from one generation to the next. So we've given you an overview, so I get that paper out of my way. And we'll talk about telephone game. Anyone ever play the telephone game? All right, so the telephone game goes such, and you could do it, it doesn't even have to be a telephone, but you phone somebody up and you say, here's a message I'm giving to you, and you give a specific message, and you say, now you got to call somebody else. And they call somebody, and they call somebody, and they call somebody, and finally it comes all the way back around, and the last person calls the originator of the message, and he gives them that message. And you see how most of the time it's kind of garbled. People put their own spin on it, they add to it, they forget key points of it, and sometimes it's kind of comical. Well, that's what a lot of folks will use as a slam on the Bible. They say, well, the message that you received supposedly from God was passed down verbally, and who knows how many times it was changed before somebody finally started in writing it down on some kind of thing. Maybe it's the parchment. And then it got lost, and then people found old copies, and then they started to make more copies, and they made copies, and the copies of the original, the autograph, has changed everything. And so you can't believe in that, and it's just not possible. So what we have to do is we have to find out if we can believe in the words that the prophets and the apostles gave down generation to generation, were accurately and carefully transmitted all the way through those generations to us. And so how can we trust it? Well, that's what the whole course is about. So the whole point is, can we trust, and are we being told what we are supposed to write down? The exchange of words is meant to be an accurate transfer of information. And the reason why is so that we can learn from the wisdoms of our predecessors. So, originally, Moses has been credited with the writings of the first 5 books of the Bible. And that's often called the Pentateuch. And that includes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, the reason why we can start believing that these things happen was you can even go to the New Testament because Jesus was comfortable with the thought, with the belief that the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, was written by Moses through God. So in Mark 12, verse 26, Jesus says, "But regarding the fact that the dead rise again, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the passage about the burning bush, how God spoke to him, saying, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob." And then also, God's people made records for making sure that the teachings and the memories could be passed correctly. So, for an example, we have in Numbers 33:2, we have Moses recorded their starting places according to their journeys by the command of the Lord, and these are the journeys according to their starting places. So, this is information that God had Moses write down for us so that we would know the travel of the Israeli nation throughout the wilderness. And in Numbers, so that was Numbers, and in Deuteronomy, we hear in the book of Law, Deuteronomy 31, 24 through 27 says, "It came about when Moses finished writing the words of his law in a book until they were complete, that Moses commanded the Levites who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, take this book of the law and place it beside the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may remain there as a witness against you. For I know your rebellion and your stubbornness. Behold, while I am still alive with you today, you have been rebellious against the Lord. How much more then after my death?" And then Joshua even continued the practice of recording Israel's history. And you find that over in Joshua 24, verse 26. "And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God, and he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak that was by the sanctuary of the Lord." So the point is that all of these books were written down and passed down, and we can have confidence that it's there because they were commanded by God to do it, and we have examples throughout the New Testament and the Old Testament how the people were told to write this down and pass it down. So now we have to find out, how can we believe that it was transmitted correctly? And that's where we know that they were commanded to transmit it correctly. Now let's see if they did. So we had Moses, we had Joshua passing those down. So now we look at the copies, because what we have is the original that was written down by Moses, passed down, and finally collected. So for a timeline, let's just put this out. Old Testament, probably written somewhere between 1500 BC and finally collated and copied and kept around 400 BC. Roughly about 1,100 years it was written down, but it wasn't collected all as one real good book until about 400 by the Hebrews, or the Israeli nation in Hebrew. So that's when it's collected. So now we have to find out, is this collection is now called the autograph. This is the autograph. So now we have to find out, is all of the handwritten copies of copies, are they accurate? Because we want to know, How accurate is the Bible? Historical accuracy is most easily checked the more recent it comes out. The closer the written version of the Bible is to the copy, the original there versus the copy, the closer in timeline, that's what I'm trying to spit out, the easier it is to verify. Now, that's why the New Testament is a whole lot easier to verify than the Old Testament, because we have a lot more writings and collections and pieces of it. Plus, it was written a lot later on, so that the timeline really condenses quite a bit. So these are all in trying to find out all this information. You can compare it with historical documents. And this is where it makes it a little bit easier to see how you can have more confidence in the Bible. There's a lot of historical writings that have been collected and passed down, and people accept them completely as accurate. So let's look at some of them. I don't have a slide for this one, though. Plato. Plato is very famous for his philosophy, and he lived from 427 to 347 BC. So he lived in the 400s and the 300s of BC. There's 7 manuscripts that we have of Plato to look at. And the youngest one of them is 1,300 years old. So you have 1,300 years to look back at the person who actually wrote it, the autograph of Plato, and everyone accepts it as completely authentic. No changes have been done. And then you have Homer was even older with his copy of Iliad, and there's more copies of that. That was written roughly in 900 BC. There's 643 copies of that. So that's 500 years after it was written that we have the copies that we can compare. Say, okay, he wrote it in 900, and the only left now are 643 copies 500 years old after that timeline. But yet nobody doubts that the Iliad is a famous historical writing, and it's accurate from what it was. You have a couple more. The history of Thucydides, I apologize for butchering his name. There's 8 manuscripts of his. He was in the 400 BC time frame, and this is the history written down of him, and it's 1,300 years old. Caesar, everyone knows about Caesar, Julius Caesar. He lived in 100 BC to 44 BC as one of the first Roman emperors. There's 10 manuscripts of him left, and their latest one was 1,000 years old. So how do we compare that with the New Testament? And then we'll get to the Old Testament. Well, the New Testament, pretty safe to say that it was written between 40 and 100 AD. So that's the period it was collected, those 60 years it was collected. And how old is the copies that we have of that? Well, we have 5,300 copies of the New Testament, and it was 225 years old. So it's easier to track this down because we have a much larger quantity of the documents, both whole letters and pieces and parts. We even have up to 24,000 pieces, individual pages, individual parchments, small pieces of different letters that we know about that were only 50 years after it happened. So all these things can be authenticated a whole lot easier than things that the regular people in the world take as granted as being authorized and equal to the original autograph. So it's just giving you an idea of how to use the examples, because these are accepted without question by historical scholars as accurate without blemish. accounts of history. So now let's compare that with the Old Testament transmission and why we have it the way we do. We don't have nearly as many copies or pieces of it, and even the oldest copies are several hundred years after the original documents. Even though we don't have as many, we can verify it we can have the confidence because we know of the customs of the Jewish scribes who copied them through the centuries. They were strictly regulated on how they did it. The regulations were there to ensure the accuracy. All the skins had to be the same size. The columns had to be lined. They only could use a certain type of skin that they wrote on. It had to be clean. They could only use black ink, and it was used with a specific recipe to make it. And there was no writings from memory, and the scribe must view and verify every single letter that he wrote on that. They even had rules that if the king walked in while these scribes were writing, they were not to acknowledge the king until they were done writing that line, so that they could not use any writings by memory or anything like that. But you still wonder, if they were so specific in writing all this down, how come we still don't have as many copies? Well, it's because they had a very strict ritual for disposing of the older copies that were worn or damaged. So in putting this all together, we are held accountable for what we have, and what we look at is in John 16, verse 7 and 8. But I tell you the truth, it is to your advantage that I go away. This is Jesus speaking. For if I do not go away, the Helper will not come to you. But if I go, I will send him to you. And he, when he comes, will convict the world concerning sin and righteousness and judgment. Concerning sin, because they do not believe in me. And concerning righteousness, because I go to the Father and you no longer see me. And concerning judgment, because the ruler of this world has been judged. So he's talking about the Spirit. He's talking about the Spirit coming to help us. And this is how we know that we are going to have help in transmitting and translating and passing on the message that we have from God. And then you can look at some of the skeptics and the critics that have complaints about this, and we find out that people say, well, you had too many errors by the writers while they were doing it, and that passed the message on incorrectly. And then you have just a collection of tales and fables and stories. So those are a couple of the complaints that critics have. But yet we now, as we go through all this and as we go through more of it, we're going to find out that there's copies that have been old and used and passed on, and we can compare those old copies to what we have today and see how close they are. And then we find older copies written down, and we compare the two, and we find out in the New Testament it's 99% accurate. And the inaccuracies that they find are usually a misspelled letter, a written down letter, because it can happen. And there's almost no false facts that change the oldest copies we find to the newest copies that we find. And definitely they do not change any of the basic lessons that you read out of the Bible or the commandments. They don't change any of the factual information. So that answers that. And then going through, as we will a little bit more, information about the scribes and how they wrote things down. That was some that I gave you there. But when we read a little bit more later about the tribe that did it during the period that they did it and how the accuracy that they have, and then you can compare it to something that we found that's 500 years older than that, you'll see the accuracies really come into play. So with that, let's switch over to the next lesson, please. Click. Those are the questions that we're going to skip. All right, so this is lesson 4, a little bit more detailed. This is on the Old Testament manuscripts. Now, the Old Testament manuscripts, when they were written down, obviously they were written in Hebrew because that was the language of the Jews. And we're going to examine some of the best available ancient documents from which we got this Old Testament. So there's some prominent documents from the Old Testament that we find. And the first one we call the Aleppo Codex. And this was, and a codex is, just to remind you, a codex is simply multiple sheets bound together. This was written in the 10th century AD, and it was actually 930 AD. And this was the best complete text of the Hebrew Bible that we had. But then we had the Aleppo riots, and that's in Syria, in 1947 that destroyed a quarter of this document. We lost all of Genesis and all the way through Deuteronomy 28 through Songs 3:12 through the end. And that's why it's no longer the best version that we can get. The next one we have is the Leningrad Codex. And this was now considered the oldest complete Testament manuscript. And it is written in Cairo, Egypt, but it's currently on display in St. Petersburg, Russia, right now. And it was written somewhere between 1000 and 1040 AD. And this, compared with the Aleppo Codex, you'll see, again, 99% accuracy and comparison. So the Leningrad Codex now is the oldest, it was at this moment, the oldest copy. And that came, 1,100 years after it was, 1,500 years after. Yes, David.
Would those codexes be the entire Old Testament or just portions of it?
This one says that they're the full copy of the Old Testament. It's the full copy. So there's no guessing on any books that aren't included. They're all there. And that also shows you and gives you confidence that the Bible was written for the Old Testament version and collected in 400 BC, that it is 1,500 years later, it's the same copy that we have because that's when we see this. Everything was included. It had all the Old Testament. It had the wisdoms. It had the Old and New, the major and minor prophets informations. It's all in there, same version in this. Now, the Leningrad and Aleppo codexes were collected, and they call these the Masorete copies. So both of these came from the family of the Masorete, who were tasked by the Jewish church to collect and copy, and it came from one major family from 500 AD to 1100 AD, this group of Masoretes, this family of Masoretes, and a specific family out of that, I should say more like a colony. And then you have this family of the Ben Ashers. They were famous for their meticulous care, just like we were talking a little bit ago about how all of the scribes would write, and they had to do all these specific steps and take all these specific steps. They're extremely meticulous, and then you can see that it's copied just the same, and there's 99%. The text was unattainable, and that's why that tradition started, that they wanted to make more copies of the Hebrew Bible. They developed the vowel systems to aid non-Hebrews, native readers, but it's still in Hebrew. So that's what they have to use. So it's all nice to know that we have the Bible, but it's so old, how could we possibly be sure? Well, if it's 1,100 years from the time it's written at the earliest to 1,500 years early with the Old Testament, that's nice, but that's a long period of time to make sure it's right. And then 1947 occurs, and besides the Aleppo riots where you lost a quarter of that, there was a huge find, and that was the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were discovered actually in March of 48. And I told you a little bit about this before. The shepherd boy threw a rock in a cave trying to get his goat out of there, and instead he broke a big urn that was filled with scripts and scrolls. So it was the most significant archaeological find of the 20th century. Now, what they found was the Qumran community was the area where these were found. And it's off the Dead Sea, so you know that it's there. And in these caves, there was 11 different caves that they found through information. And there were over 1,000 different parchments, most of them full. But what did they find in there? Well, what they found was the scrolls contained all of the Old Testament, except for the book of Esther. And they had the Isaiah scroll, where they had the full book and the dates from before BC 100 is when it was written. So the import of this is they just cut off 1,000 years out of the timeline and showed that we can show these were written and collected roughly 100 BC, and the book was only put together in 400 BC, roughly. So maybe it's 300 years now from the time it was written to the time it was found, the oldest one. So this is huge in what we found. But there's been critics that have asked, how in the world can you verify that we've got these scrolls that are that old, and how can you verify and be sure that they're from 1,000? 100 AD. Or BC. Well, they found out 3 different ways they verified it. First, archaeologists had 6 major seasons of excavations and found in these 11 different caves all this information. And they found coinage that showed different kings of the era, showed from 138 to 129 BC. There was coinage from one there. And they found artifacts that were shown to be from 103 to 76 BC. There was also an earthquake that occurred, and that was in 31 BC, and that was written down in 100 AD by Josephus, a famous scholar at the time that wrote a lot about the Jewish church, the Jewish history. And he even talked about this earthquake in this area. Well, then it was reoccupied by the same group of people in the Qumran community, and they stayed there until the Romans occupied it by force and kicked them all out. And that was before, in the Julius Caesar's time frame, about 100 to 40 BC. So there's a lot of ways to say that these were found in that time frame, and that's how old they were. They also found, when they looked at the scrolls, they found that the style of writing was equal to the timeline that they had figured out before. The style of writing had the same kind of capital letters put together the same way, and they also had carbon dating that proved this timeline too. So there was a lot of information that put together to verify that this is there, and there weren't. And so this, I think, what we find out, you find one of the best finds in this whole thing is the book of Isaiah that they found. In the book of Isaiah, which is always known and thought of as a tremendous prophetic book that tells what's going to happen in Jesus' time. Well, people had said, well, yeah, somebody wrote that after it happened. Well, a lot of critics will say that. Well, now you find the book of Isaiah here dated 100 BC, 150 years before Jesus was even alive. And what you find in there is some of his prophecies. So Isaiah 9, verse 7, he talks about the heir to the throne of David, meaning Jesus. He says in verse 14 of chapter 7, a virgin shall conceive a son and call him Emmanuel. In Isaiah 40, 3 through 5, the way will be prepared. He's talking about John the Baptist. In Isaiah 53, 3, he will be rejected by his own people, the Jews. Talking about Jesus. Isaiah 53, 1, he will not be believed. 53, 7, he will be silent to his accusers. He will be spat on and struck. So all these things now are verified by carbon dating, by style of writing, by archaeologists, that the books that they found, the scrolls that they found in the Dead Sea area, is truly from that time frame, and it shows gives you more faith and confidence that you know that the word is accurate. Now you can check, and the other thing is so now you have an older version of the text. So here's the scrolls that we found just now. But we also have the old versions of the Masoretic text, the Aleppo and Leningrad codexes. Now we compare the two of them. How close are they? Was that 95.5%? 95% accuracy compared to 99.5 for the New Testament? That's pretty accurate. Does anybody have confidence in the Bible that it's true? That the version that we have now, this one, has no significant difference than the scrolls that were found in the Dead Seas or the Masoretic texts that are over here. Put them all together, see how close this one is to this one, to this one. And you'll be able to tell your critics that, yes, I do believe, and there's a reason I believe it. It's found by facts. It shows us over and over again that we have the right information that we want. So now let's go to some questions. Do you ever read the footnotes in your Bible? And how have they enhanced your Bible study? This is open questions to anyone who wants. And we have 2 microphones in the back there. We can see if we can make Dave run again. Questions? Yes, right here, Robert.
More of a comment than a question.
Okay.
To me, I've been telling people for years it's very simple that either you believe God's in control or you don't.
No doubt, no doubt.
And to me, that settles the argument. But
Well, sure. See, but the thing is the reason why we're doing this class is because we believe it. All right, we already believe it. What I'm telling you now and sharing with you today and over the next couple of weeks is that the people that complain and don't believe use faulty arguments. And factually, we can show them, go step by step through different things and say, the arguments that you're making are disproved. We have too much information. So you can show their hypocrisy. Do you really believe that the book written by Homer about the Iliad and the Odyssey and all those things, these Greek stories that they wrote, is more accurate with just a couple of copies over 1,300 years versus something that we now show that this is 400 to 500 years between here and here, 5,000 texts, 24,000 pieces, parchments, and pages that we have of the Bible that we can show from when it was written to here and show you what we're showing now. You can show those. That's my point. I like to show those people. I like to know that in the back of my head. Like I started on the first day when we talked about this, we all have faith already. I'm pretty sure everyone in here believes in the Lord and believes in God and believes Jesus is our Savior. I don't think anyone in here does not believe that. So you can believe that the texts are correct. This is just to give me even more confidence when I stand up. I want to have an argument for somebody who complains to me and says, that's just a bunch of stories. Jesus was just a nice fella. I don't even know. I think he was made up. Well, do you believe in any kind of history? Most people do. Do you believe there was a Roman emperor named Julius Caesar? Do you believe there was some other Roman thing? Yeah, well, why do you do that? Well, because history says. Well, history, these same people who wrote that history, for example, Josephus wrote about not only those Roman dictators, but he also wrote about a man named Jesus. He was a factual human being. And he had this group of people that called themselves Christians. And so that's all in the history books. Yet they want to say we made them up. They don't want to believe. It's easy not to believe. You know, they don't want to believe in any of the facts. So that's what this is about. This is about telling them, listen, you don't believe? Well, I believe, but I can factually show you why you shouldn't doubt. Does that make sense? All right. Any other questions on this one? Have you ever used footnotes in your Bible, and has it enhanced your Bible study? Well, I know I have a lot. I probably have 6 or 7 different versions of the Bible. I have an ESV that has a really good study portion Bible. Same with one of my New King James Version has a lot of that. I have an NIV that has a lot of that. The New American Standard that I'm reading, I don't have as many footnotes. It's not a study version of the Bible. But when I do, I love reading through some of that because it gives you this information. When you're talking about the New Testament, because that's where we do spend most of our time reading in today's church, is we spend a lot of time more time over the New Testament versus the Old Testament because we know we're under the new law. But what we do is we find out that when you're reading some of those footnotes, you can see historical things. I'm a big historical nut. So I find it fascinating that you can draw a parallel line with the studies and the history that we have in the Bible when we're reading through all this, that they're not made up. They're historical places. They're historical facts that are 2,000 years old. And that tells me that's a copy that I'm reading right now that's extremely accurate. So I love those. I love those footnotes. Especially the study versions. They give you a lot of information. All right, think about the preservation of the Aleppo Codex. If your own house was burning, what do you think you would be sure to grab on your way out? Do you have any Bibles given to you by older relatives that have become precious to you? To me, it's not as important nowadays to grab that Bible. I think that just means a lot to us individually. But I do know that I live in a day where, and a time and a country, that I can go get another copy. I can digitize, I can get through the internet and get a version. I'll lose all my notes, I'll lose all my highlights and words in the edge, but it's not as important as it was, say, 100 years ago. What about 400 years? What about in 1700? And there's only one version, and that's the King James Version. Happened in about 1608, 9, somewhere in there. That's when that was put out, and then copies were authorized, but they only made 50 copies. It was kept in the church. Well, I think if I was around in that time frame, I'd be running to grab a copy of that, because you just don't have a lot of access to it. But nowadays, I think we have a lot more availability to get them. Any more comments on that? All right, when I put these questions up there, I don't have to answer them all, right? Y'all jump in here. Have you ever traveled to a place where you felt the Bible had to be smuggled? Have you heard stories about people who have? How about some of our missionaries? Don't we have some coming in a couple weeks? Art? Yeah. You want to? See, I reminded them.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I was just taking a shameless plug there.
I'm checking that off my list. But yeah, think about some of the missionaries that we have. I don't think High and Byron feel like they have to smuggle it where they're at, but Richard might have felt that he had to do a little of that when he was down with his missionary work. And also, you know, the Prices might have had to fight through that, especially when they had all the worries over in the Ukraine. You know, I don't know, but I'm sure some would. All right, I'm not supposed to share these stories. Y'all are. Just saying, somebody's got one. All right, we'll go to another question. All right, what do you think the value is of having the Old Testament manuscripts that themselves were copied before the time of Christ? Because remember, when we started this and we're looking at the Aleppo Codex, it was 930. Yes, Art? Make him run. He's coming.
Go there, Richard.
Next.
You mentioned you mentioned Aleppo. That fire was in the 1940s.
Correct.
A Jewish scholar tried to go in there a decade before that and do a photographic study of that, and they were so zealous in protection of that, they would not let him photograph that bound copy that was the entire Bible, or they would have had the whole thing saved. But there was a scholar later on in the 1900s that took all the other not complete copies, but all those Masorete texts, and without looking at the Aleppo copy that was only 60% complete, he recreated it, and when they compared that to what they had of the Aleppo, it was almost identical. So they were able to take what he had done and kind of compare that to what should have been in the rest of the Aleppo. And the thing about that fire, there's scholars that don't think that that actually destroyed the thing, that they use that as a reason for some Jews to have stolen portions of that, because later on in the 1900s, there were 2 individual pages of what they thought were burned that turned up. Yeah. One was like 1st or 2nd Chronicles, and one was something else. But anyway, the Aleppo Codex is a very interesting story. People might want to just Google it and read about it, but it does strengthen your faith to think about how complete the Bible is.
Anyone else on that from way over here? We have a couple more minutes. What do you find most interesting about the Masorete or Qumran communities? Would you view them as examples of God working through the people in this world? I sure would. I think we read, the Spirit will be sent to help us. And the Spirit certainly had to have been working in those communities to give us what we have. It goes back to the very first lesson that we talked about and all of the guidance and commands that the Lord gave Moses and Joshua and everyone else to collect, to write down, to pass down an accurate version of his word. Yes, Larry. There you go. He actually does run. That's kind of impressive.
Yeah, I was just going to say, back to the point made earlier, that God is in charge. If you imagine that you have been commissioned by God to write something down, and you would tell other people that God told me to do this, and we need to be careful with it, and we need to preserve it word for word, because I got every single word from God. And a lot of what you're covering shows that people took it that seriously, that the original writers considered it so important that it be preserved word for word, that they passed that seriousness and that sense of urgency on down through the generations.
And I think that was our second bell. So, but if the Masoretes or the members of the Masoretes or the Qumran community could speak today, what do you think they would urge you to do? And yeah, very good, Jenny. You read, she said. Know the Bible. Look at how serious they took it and how serious we should take it. That's all I have for today. We'll pick this up next week. Thank you.